it is, and thank you so much for inviting me here to present. It's an honor to be here, and it's so great to see you all in 3D again. I know that you heard it several times already this week, but it is really great to actually see the people that I'm speaking to. As Nils Peter mentioned, I am running a law firm focusing on CCS, or CO2 basically. It's CCS, CCU, negative emissions, EUR, anything to do with CO2 basically. And we work globally, although we are small. So we have one person in Australia, in Tasmania of all places, one in Denmark, and we are 3 people in Norway. So we're growing, but we're still small and flexible, and we have a lot of fun at work, getting to work with all of you guys, being from a technical perspective. And we've heard about these amazing projects today and how these work from a technical perspective, and we've heard about public acceptance and all those things. And now I'm going to pour some cold water on you and ruin the day by saying that things are not necessarily always working from a legal perspective. Sorry about that. But I'll do a very, very brief legal introduction to CO2 EUR and transitioning CO2 EUR to CCS. I will not talk about the technology because, well, most of you probably understand the technology much better than I do, and I will leave that to the experts. I'm just going to scare you with everything that doesn't work from a legal perspective. And I'll talk a little bit about technical standards and how we might use technical standards to bridge some of those gaps that I have identified in the framework. And I'll just give you some concluding remarks at the end. So this is the starting point, CO2 EUR, transitioning that to CCS. There aren't really any technical hurdles. It works. Well, at least that's what you engineers and geologists tell me, and I'm just choosing to trust you. So all the problems that we see, or most of the problems we see, are from an economic and legal perspective. And why? It's not because it's prohibited most places, but it's more that it's not ready. It's not thought of, or it's kind of complicated, and the way there isn't really easy to see. And one of the reasons why is that we operate in 2 different regimes mostly, for CO2 EUR and for CCS. So you have CO2 EUR mostly being regulated under petroleum regimes around the world. I'll give you a couple of examples. I've included a couple of case studies to kind of show you how these are, or how this issue is approached differently in different jurisdictions. And then CCS is kind of, it's an odd animal, odd creature that is implemented in a variety of legal instruments and a variety of kind of separate regimes in countries around the world. And those, sometimes they match fairly well, we will see that later, but sometimes they're just completely different and completely separate. And for those of you who are doing this offshore, I'll talk more about transport tomorrow, and we already heard Daniel talk about transport yesterday, and third-party access and shipping and all those things. And the London Protocol is, for example, a famous instrument for being a little bit problematic in terms of cross-border transportation. However, it doesn't apply to CO2 EUR, it only applies to CCS. So kind of, it's very separate regimes, both from an international perspective and then down to the national regimes. So starting out from a European perspective, since we are in Europe and most of us are, well, many of us here are from EU countries, we have a CCS directive that doesn't directly include CO2 EUR. It's mentioned though in the preamble, and it says that if we are combining it with geological storage of the CO2, then the directive applies. And what does that really mean? So it has been assumed, I've read some reports, assuming that this means that it doesn't apply to associated storage or incidental storage, which is what we very often talk about when we talk about CO2 EUR. My hypothesis is that that is wrong. I think it actually does apply to the incidental storage. However, it's all about how we operate the CO2 EUR project. So if you take a step back, having 2 separate regimes very often means that when you characterize the storage, or you characterize a reservoir for petroleum production, you are not characterizing that for CO2 retention. But if you are actually from the start off saying that we are going to do CO2 EUR here, so we are characterizing it both for production of petroleum and for retention of CO2. And then you're following the hoops of the regulations saying how to document the CO2 that you're injecting, how to quantify the amounts that are actually retained, how to separate what is naturally in place in the storage site or in the reservoir already, what is recycled, et cetera, then you actually have a quantifiable and trustworthy number to present to your public authority saying that this is the amount of CO2, of anthropogenic CO2, that we have stored as part of the hydrocarbon productions in the EUR project that we have. I believe that that is actually included in this CCS directive, but we have to do it right. I'm going to get back to that a little bit later, but to give you a couple of examples to show you how different or how separate things are, I've included a case study from Norway, and this is it's a horrible slide, and I apologize for that, but it's kind of to demonstrate that we have one regime for petroleum and one regime for CO2 storage. But you could do CO2 injections as part of the petroleum regime. We've done that for Sleipner and Snøhvit for many, many years before we even got the CCS directive. So as a consequence, we continued to say that if we are doing CO2 injections as part of a petroleum project, even if it could be a CO2 EUR project, it could be Sleipner, it could be a new hydrocarbon project that needs to separate the CO2 for some reason or another, that would continuously be regulated under the petroleum framework. However, we have transposed the CCS directive into that framework so that we have taken into consideration the characterization, the demonstration of the CO2 being retained. So we are still keeping true to the CCS directive's provisions. But then for all other types of CO2, like Longship, which is an ongoing demonstration project, and all other future projects where we are taking CO2 from another industrial source and we are injecting that into a greenfield, that will be regulated under a separate regime. So how to transfer from one to the other, it's not possible. It is probably possible, and usually if there's a will, there is a way, and the will is usually controlled by money, so this will be fixable at some point. But the thing is that if we do have an EUR project in Norway, and you want to transfer that into a CCS project, you need to go away from the petroleum framework that has a purpose of producing petroleum, and you have to enter into the storage regulations, which has a sole purpose of storing CO2. And that has some consequences, for example, for tax regimes. So for petroleum productions and any associated activity within that project, you have to, for example, pay a 77% tax of the petroleum that you are selling, but you can also write off 77% of the costs, the expenses of developing that project. In the CCS world, it's 27%. So those are not comparable. So you have to kind of transfer, you have to decommission the project within the petroleum framework and then move over to the storage framework. It's possible, it will probably happen, but still, it's kind of, there isn't a clear pathway today. There isn't a provision in the storage directive or in the Norwegian implementation of the storage directive how to make this happen. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of working with Alexandra, who would be our next speaker, and Roman and several others in this room in EcoBase, and we did a case study on several countries in southeastern Europe to see how they had implemented the CCS directive. And as Norway, they have two pathways. So they have a petroleum framework, and then they have implemented the CCS directive in a separate regulation. However, in their petroleum regulations, what we found back in 2019 is that they don't have any mechanisms in the petroleum framework to recognize CO2 being stored as part of the EUR process. So they don't have any characterization for CO2 retainment, they don't have any quantification, verification, and reporting mechanisms to recognize the volumes of CO2 actually being stored. So as a consequence, they cannot access the ETS allowances, which is an additional incentive to do this project in Romania, and there are other things as well that will be affecting the overall project. But in the end, it also means it's very hard to establish a baseline. So while we in Norway had that framework in place to quantify, verify, characterize, and all of that, and actually produce a baseline for if we want to transfer into a CCS project, it's much harder to do that in Romania because they haven't any requirements to do the quantification in the first place. So two very different approaches. We are both subject to the same framework because even though Norway is not an EU member, we are tied to the framework through the European Economic Agreement, or EEA. And stepping out of the EU, comparing to the US, since we also have a few US speakers here today and also participants, it's a completely different situation. And we heard earlier that John was talking about how some of the CO2 in that project could be used for EUR, which is great. And he comes from a state with primacy and with a very clarified framework in many perspectives, but not all states are as easy to interpret as North Dakota. So you have a long experience in the US to do CO2 EUR. You also have a clear framework, federal framework for both CO2 EUR and for CCS. But here we also see there are separate pathways. They have separate liability regimes. They have separate there are a lot of separate things, but also very much a copy-paste on some of the more general provisions. However, EPA made a great move to begin with, including a term or a provision that allows you to transfer. And you can even stay within the regime for CO2 EUR, transferring into CCS if you're not risking the increased risk to the overall storage site or the operations. And they're looking for risk for example, increased pressure and the risk for the underground or the water. That's kind of their purpose. While we have our petroleum framework and our CCS directive from an environmentally perspective, they come in from a drinking water perspective because they have done all of these activities onshore till now, and that could conflict with underground sources of drinking water. So if they are scared of transferring from EUR to CCS will increase the pressure in the reservoir, for example, you need to transfer into the Class 6 regime and get a new permit for the operations. Which is fine, okay, they've thought of that, so there is a regime. However, it stops maybe in some other more state regulations and state issues. For example, long-term liability and property rights. John mentioned earlier that in his state you have the same owner of the surface as the pore space. But in many states, these are split up. So you can have one surface owner, one subsurface owner, one mineral rights owner, one pore space owner, and you can even have several ownerships following the zones, the geological zones. So it's very complicated. And if you don't own these rights yourself, you have to pay a lease, or you have a lease agreement with someone, and then you enter into a lease agreement with someone on the predicament that you are going to produce petroleum. You pay a royalty for that, and then you transfer into CCS, which has a totally different economic regime. You need a new agreement, which might complicate things. The landowner might not be interested in letting you do that because it's less profitable. So anyway, we know it's possible. We know there is some framework in place. Can we use some of the technical standards that we have already produced to bridge some of the gaps? I think we can. And in particular, we are working on a technical committee. Niels Peter is part of that, and several others as well, negotiating technical standards for CCS and EOR. And these are all technology neutral, regulatory neutral, so they can be used all over the globe, or at least we do as best as we can to make sure that they are. And they also complement other standards. So for example, for EOR, there is a range of standards available already for the operations of an EOR project. But we have published a standard in this project that allow us to characterize the reservoir, not just for petroleum production, but for retention of CO2, and to make sure that we have a way of documenting and ensuring the containment. And we are through a very thorough methodology for quantifying the CO2 that is being associatedly stored or incidentally stored, or how you want to look at it. So we can document, we can demonstrate that this is safe, it's long-term, and the CO2 that is actually retained in the storage site is the anthropogenic CO2 that we have injected for the purpose. So it separates out the CO2 already in place in the reservoir. It separates out the natural CO2 that you might have bought from somewhere and mixed in with the stream. And in the end, you get out with a net number of tons that you have stored that you can get ETS allowances for, or for example, 45Q tax credits for. So it's very useful. And this document is actually recognized also by the IRS in the US as one of the tools available to quantify and verify the CO2 stored. And as a next step, we are working on a technical report, which is less prescriptive. It's more describing the current situation of technology. How can we actually transfer the CO2 EOR to CCS? And it also looking into the regulatory perspectives from several jurisdictions like the US and Norway. And we're looking into more the political situation and project situation and how this could be beneficial. So stay tuned, it will be published hopefully within a couple of years. We are working fiercely on it. So this is my basically my last slide. It's just summing up what I've already been saying, that there are some issues from a regulatory perspective transferring from EOR to CCS, but since it is working from a technical perspective, let us take the instruments we have, for example in ISO, and also upcoming instruments, to help policymakers, national regulators, to put in place the missing pieces so that we can take into use these processes. Because I personally believe it is better to empty out the oil fields and then reuse the infrastructure to continue doing CCS than developing a completely new project. From an economic perspective, that makes total sense for me, at least. Happy to discuss, happy to take questions, and I would like to acknowledge Climate, who is sponsoring my participation in ISO. Thank you.